To the greatest generation, a very special welcome, and to those of lesser generation aspiring to greatness, you may stay. What I hope to do today is to piece together a part of the past and a retrospective, partly a memoir, dealing with the Nuremberg trials where I served for a couple of years, especially during the more famous trial in 1945-46. And I plan to approach my topic from three directions. I think I'd better use this. Testing? Okay. I plan to approach this topic from three directions. One, some glimpses into the mind and the hearts of the defendants and their families, as these are revealed in letters which were written from the prison to the families and letters of returning to the prisoners from their families. These revelations came to me since I was censor at the trials. Secondly, a quick glimpse at the problems inherent in judging war crimes, the obstacles, pitfalls, utility, and yet the absolute necessity of continuing to try to find a way to do these things. And finally, a personal retrospective kind of memoir where I will deal with the contradictory impulses experienced by an 18-year-old American GI. All three of the above could be the sole subject, but the decision to touch on salient aspects of all three and relate them to the topic of dilemma, I think, might be more rewarding. First of all, my role as censor at the trials. I was assigned to Nuremberg at the beginning of 1946. Trials had begun in 1945. And my job, very briefly, was to censor mail going in and out of the prison. This meant that each of the major accused was allowed two letters, or rather one letter and a postcard each week, and they were allowed to receive mail from their families. There was also mail from witnesses. I'll go into a little more detail in a little bit. First, what I want to do is refer you to the handout where I try to refresh some memories as to what was in that courtroom, what the distribution of people were, primarily a list of the defendants. Some of those you probably remember, others may have faded, and I'll talk about a few of them in a little while. Now, the International Military Tribunal, and this was the first of its kind. Since then, I'm sure you've heard of many more, was convened on the 20th of November in 1945. There were 21 defendants and organizations such as the Gestapo, stormtroopers, the SA, the SS, and the High Command of the Armed Forces. The accused were prosecuted by legal delegates of the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Union Socialist Soviet Republics, 4 nations of 18 signatory to the charter, unique in world history, which created the International Military Tribunal. Also in the courtroom, which still contained the figure of Moses holding the Ten Commandments, were 4 judges from the 4 nations mentioned and their alternates. There were 4 counts to the indictment, and I will abbreviate those. First, the common plan or conspiracy to show that the following 3 counts were planned and premeditated. 2, crimes against peace, violation of international treaties and agreements. 3, war crimes, methods of war and military occupation in conflict with laws and customs of war, crimes against armies, prisoners of war, civilians. And 4, crimes against humanity, murder and persecution of those opposed to the Nazi Party or to the common plan as indicated in count 1. Now, as I say, my special view of the events were in an office where we received the mail. Exactly what was I to censor? Well, not very complicated. One, I was to look for any hints of plans to escape, which of course was totally unrealistic, since the walls were very high, and the accused were no longer of a swashbuckling age, whatever they had been. And if they had gotten over the wall, there were tanks and other overkill precautions waiting for them. We were also to look for hints of mental instability, hints of suggestions about suicide, because it was deemed important that the accused remain in good physical and psychological condition in order to be able to stand trial. This was a showpiece, among other things. Of course, we also intercepted packages, cookies from home, which might be dangerous. And then there was another category, which we generally call crank mail, and which were relegated to a file poetically called the 201 file, very Army style. And I will give you some, I have some here to show you some of these examples. They were primarily crank letters from Germans who were blaming the accused for having lost the war, having left Germany in rubble, being the cause of the deprivations they were suffering. There were also letters from victims or those left behind by victims, which might consist of death notices, of explanations of what happened to their loved ones, etc. And then there were those who wrote from all parts of the world to suggest that they make their peace with the Lord and find a way to salvation through prayer. Some offered to do it for them. And then once in a while, a humorous one, such as a few letters from Americans asking for autographs. Now, the general correspondence, I just wrote down some excerpts of which I've also distributed some parts. But the 201 file I thought was available for liberation, so I brought a few home. Liberation, to those of you who were not there, meant that you kind of borrowed them. The reason I didn't copy many of the excerpts is because there's a certain consistency to them. What's striking as you read the mass of them is that the defendants show a certain irony, what psychologists call doubling. That is that in the same person, at the same time, you have an individual who has committed the worst crimes, and not just alleged, in most cases they were proven, the documents were there, who at the same time could correspond with their families like the most loving, devoted husbands and fathers, totally suspending the other part of their personality. I'll give you some examples. The first one I call your attention to, and I won't necessarily do this in order. Didn't leave anything myself. Let's talk first about the excerpt from Julius Streicher. Now, he made Streicher familiar note. He was the Gauleiter, kind of a regional leader in Nuremberg. He's best remembered as someone strutting at the head of a parade, barrel-chested, booted, with a whip in his hand, a bullwhip. He's basically a very dumb person, uneducated person, a vulgar person, who was looked down upon by every one of the other defendants. Didn't belong in the same box, and legally speaking, he probably shouldn't have been, since he had very little influence on the planning and on the carrying out of the crimes. but no one regretted that he was sentenced to death. Now this man, who, Rebecca West calls him the kind of person who gives trouble in parks. He was a pornographer, among other things, and especially a Jew baiter. And yet he writes, he urged the extermination, knowing it was being carried out. And yet this man can write to his son about his wife, who was in the prison at the same time as a witness, hearing her laughter in the courtyard and explaining, poor German youth, where is their example? There's nothing hypocritical about this, at least not intentionally, and this kind of sets the tone for what most of them were doing in these letters. Next, let's look at Keitel, Wilhelm Keitel, the Chief of Staff, Chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces, typically weak, pliant military man who carried out the commands generated by others. Signed many orders related to counts 3 and counts 4, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And he does not deny having done so. But his defense, which is a defense you hear throughout the trial and the part of most of the defendants, is that he's a military man, he obeyed orders, and he served with honor. So that when he's condemned to death, and condemned to death by hanging, he has problems not with the dying, but with dying at the end of a rope, dying with dishonor. He felt he should have been shot, as an honorable military man should be. Believe it or not, there were those who agreed with him. The French justice, Saint-Just de Val, obviously the aristocratic, noble tradition, older military tradition, felt there should be 2 types of imprisonment, honorable and dishonorable. And certainly Keitel and the other General Jodl did not deserve, in his opinion, to die at the end of a rope, but should have been shot like soldiers. In the excerpt we have from him, you see primarily a certain self-pity and the expression of this disgrace of having to die like a common criminal. Next, I'll call your attention to an excerpt from Rudolf Höss, now H-O-E-S. He's not to be confused with Rudolf Hess, Hitler's lieutenant, who flew to, who was also in the box, who flew to England, Scotland in 1941, presumably to arrange a treaty between the British and the Germans. Totally unsuccessful, the British never entertained it, but it was, his flight was successful insofar as the Russians always believed that something was afoot, some alliance of that sort was afoot to get us in. Now, he was in Nuremberg as a witness, and believe it or not, he was there as a defense witness. What did he do? He was the commandant at Auschwitz. And in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, there's a document about him where he admits to having gassed 2.5 million Jews. Actually, it was only 1.5 million, but let's not quit it. So, this man also writes home, and he speaks of the nurturing atmosphere of his 9-year-old son, who was spending the sunniest of childhoods in Auschwitz. This was later hanged, a gallows facing the gas chambers. Goring, the most illustrious, the strongest, most interesting of the defendants, who the only one who never blamed anyone but himself, did not blame Hitler, but he tried to keep up the strength not only for himself, but of the other defendants. He has many roles. He was Supreme Leader of the SA, General of the SS, President of the Reichstag, Minister of Interior of Prussia, Chief of Prussian Police and Secret Police, Vice Minister of the Air, Chief of the Air Force and Secret Police, head of the Hermann Goering Industrial Combine, and he was successor designate to Hitler. He was also Reichsjägermeister, which means he was the head of all the hunters in Germany. And for each of these roles, he had a uniform which he loved to wear. You've seen in many uniforms. He, as I say, he was successor designate to Hitler, and he made a mistake at the end of the war, when he was in Bavaria, calling Hitler to ask if it was time for him to step in. Hitler promptly had him arrested by the Gestapo, and shortly thereafter he was caught by the Allies. He had his signature all over the place. He had signed the only extant order giving Reinhard Heydrich the responsibility for preparing the final solution. He was found guilty on all 4 counts and condemned to hang. Now, with a background like that, he writes many letters to his wife and daughter. And here again we see this duplicity, this double thing. In the excerpts, we have a letter to his wife where he decries the persecution, that's his word, perpetrated by hate-filled mortal enemies. He appeals to the Almighty, who will not let our people perish. In a speech, I have an excerpt here from a speech he made early in the days of the Reich, where he credits God with finding the Führer to lead them to greatness. He makes, in letters to his daughter, 9-year-old daughter, Etta, he makes references to progress in school and spring flowers. Very good German romantic. And then there are other letters which we don't have here, where he talks about not giving in to the mortal enemies. Don't let them get at our soul. Interesting, almighty soul, this vocabulary. He speaks of the absurdity of Russian Bolsheviks accusing Germans, tens of thousands of girls and women in prison for having been in the Hitler Youth. He's very nostalgic, and he culminates against the so-called German press, seeking sensationalism every day. There's one other letter by Robert Blake. Now, you may not have heard of him or may not remember him. Doesn't really fit this pattern completely, but it's an interesting letter. He was Minister of Labor, and in this letter he tells me some of the things he did. He was in charge of the Volkswagen works, and a very, very good industrialist. He writes to Sir Henry Ford and points out that he's always worked very hard, and he's never done anything wrong except to talk against the Jews, which Henry Ford also did, and he did. He was not considered completely there by psychologists. He had frontal lobe problems, and I'm speaking clinically here. And he committed suicide in a very unusual way. In the prison, tied an end of a garment to his neck, the other end to the pipe behind the commode, and leaned forward until he died. Now, one other note here. The letters from the families were reciprocal. Also very warm, loving letters. But I think here we have to make a distinction. I don't think there's any irony in a letter from Etta Goring when she expresses her love and affection for her father. We have to make a distinction here between those actively, directly involved in the dirty business of waging war, and realize that these people, and I guess that's some of us here who remember World War II, are separated by experience from those in the background who don't always realize what's happening. So there's nothing ironic in the letter from 9-year-old Etta. I say she's innocent. I don't know what happened to her. But if we need another punishment for Goring, probably reading letters from his daughter make for harsh chastisement. Now let me go to the next phase of my presentation, in which I deal with the law. Now, I'm not a historian, and I'm not an attorney, but I think it's worth summarizing some of the objections we might express toward war crimes trials, and then also get into why, in spite of these objections, we must continue to try to find a way to deal with them. There are, in any system of laws, in general, there are flaws. We are so fascinated by legal processes and TV courtroom dramas that we kind of get used to it. But just in general, we have minors committing major adult crimes. We have the intrusion of politics in the law. Other than O.J. Simpson, who doesn't know whether or not he was guilty. In the case of international laws, the conflicts, procedures, grounds for judgment are even more problematic. Let's just look very summarily at a few of them. First of all, war crimes. Now, to me, the notion is redundant. War is a crime. This is not a legal opinion. This is the kind of opinion you sense when you walk on battlefields like Antietam, or you've been to the American Cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, where the crosses and stars of David are lined up symmetrically, and the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. You feel this crime in your gut. But there are other problems. Codified rules, such as those of the Geneva Convention, the Hague Rules of Land Warfare dating back to 1907, are simply not applicable in wars of extermination camps and planned slaughter of civilians. Another one, if a trial is based on statutory law, crimes under count 4, that is, crimes against humanity, are exercised ex post facto prosecution. If the law doesn't exist, meaning it hasn't been written down, then how can you break it? I think the last person to appeal to that reasoning was Pinochet. Moreover, in spite of the intention of fairness at these trials, and that certainly was present, it was victor's justice. To be tried for war crimes, you have a better chance of going through that if you've lost the war. It's not completely true. You have My Lai, other examples, but basically it's victor's justice. The danger of incriminating the Allies. This was a major problem. The case of the Admiral, Denison, who took over from Hitler at the very end, and whose claim to fame was being the admiral in charge of the German Navy, in particular the submarines. And he was accused of dirty submarine warfare. But upon investigation, none other than the American Justice Francis Biddle found that, well, yes, he fought dirty sea war, but Admiral Nimitz was dirty. He was convicted, a relatively light sentence. He got 10 years because he had put his signature on documents which involved using slave labor for shipbuilding and in part for its unrestricted sea warfare. Not a more difficult problem to explain away was the Katyn massacre. The Katyn massacre took place in Poland, a situation where allegedly 1,000 Polish officers were massacred by the Germans. The because they did not have the means, the intellectual means, the background of a Shah and of Anpachen, who were found not guilty, not only because of their education, but that helped. There's public opinion. It was decided that Papen was not guilty, and Justice Lawrence, the British justice, decided that, or was heard to say that it might be more salutary to have two not guilty rather than one. So it also added friction to that list. Then there is the specific experience of the nation, of the justices' respective nations. Take Fritsch's example. Fritzsche was the Minister of Propaganda, Information. He was a deputy to Goebbels and took over from Goebbels. Wasn't really involved. Many felt he shouldn't have been grouped with the other people. He was found not guilty over the strong objections of the Soviets. The Soviet Justice Nikitchenko found that his propaganda led directly to the atrocities. And his alternate, Volchkov, found that 10 million people perished because of the theory of racial superiority propagated by people like Fritzsche. You have to keep in mind here that the Soviets bore the full brunt of the attack of the Nazis. Over 1 million were murdered or died. And there is a certain hierarchy here, suffering, of death. The Americans were the most liberal, most magnanimous. The Soviets the least. They were ready to hang everyone immediately. Churchill wasn't far behind. And the French were a little more even-handed. But, of course, by comparing the number of dead during World War II and during that whole period, this makes some sense. The defense councils were at a certain disadvantage. These people, all Germans, were chosen for their anti-Nazi past or their unengaged past. And like the other Germans, they blamed the defendants for the destruction and misery. They lacked resources. They lacked assistance and had little time for preparation. The blending of Anglo-American justice on the one hand and continental on the other presented difficulties for the prosecution as well. In continental law, we do not have the adversary setup of defense and prosecution. The role of the court, the judges, is to get at the information, to get at the truth. Cross-examination isn't part of continental procedure. So I could go on. You could expand on all these items, and they really form a basis for justified cynicism, we might say. And yet, we have to keep going. If you have any kind of belief in the possibility of moral progress, and to do that, you have to think in terms of centuries, something has to be done. The effort has to be made. There has to be an attempt to grapple with the responsibility of looking at the situation retrospectively, in tranquility if possible, to get at something that might mitigate the problems. The thought was there that it should be tried, that a humanitarian leap of faith was necessary, that we needed to progress beyond cynicism, beyond vengeance and punishment. And in that approach, American idealism inevitably tinged with certain naivete, was very predominant. It was also typical American energy and the determination to just get it done, which, although we've aged in the last 55 years, is still there. We're still the ones who go do it. There were positive results emanating from these trials which were not anticipated. One, the acquittals drove unexpectedly out of the deliberations. Instead of just lining them up, there was a process with all its flaws, and yet out of the deliberations, 3 were found not guilty. Moreover, the self-imposed role of righteous judgment had an attenuating effect on the occupation policy and conduct. Again, taking time to make sense out of things. The delay increased chances of fairness, provided a cooling off period. And it dissipated the temptation of mass purges of losers. It thus offers an alternative to leaders who would otherwise have a choice of either winning or dying. And the recognition that international law is not primarily statute law, but grows by precedent and change in public attitude. That is, reform of rules of war to conform to the reality of the 20th and now the 21st century. The Nuremberg Military Tribunal led to few, tiny, but very meaningful attempts to use international justice to rein in human bestiality. Just throw out a few names: in Bosnia, Rwanda, in South Africa, different approach. But in all these cases, an attempt, tiny as it might have been, to come to grips with what happened and to try to recognize what might be done to mitigate in the future. Very few people were caught, very few people are tried. They're trying Milosevic now, but the only other one I think was convicted was years ago, a fellow named Drozen Erdelovich, not exactly a household name anywhere. Poor Slav of the Yardbirds, they used to say, who felt guilty because he was part of a Serb group in Srebrenica, which slaughtered 1,200 people in 5 hours. Mladic, General Karadzic, they're still at large and apparently prosper. In Rwanda, a survivor, a Tutsi survivor who was hidden by Hutus, said that, well, they can't convict everyone. They can't catch everyone. Everyone killed. Even children kill children. So very few are incriminated or being tried there. I think right now there are 5 clergymen being tried in Tanzania. So it's a drop in the bucket. But in all this, something is coming out of it. There are more military tribunals. There is now the World Court, the World Criminal Court, which was signed and ratified by most people. It was signed by the United States. It was unsigned by the Bush administration for reasons being primarily the example of the Durban meetings on racism, where it became a political platform for pursuing the Israelis and the Americans. There are safeguards built into this court, but our country feels it would not be safe for American leaders and servicemen to join in. But it's a small step, and eventually it will take hold. Now, all this is not really my field of expertise, so I hope you don't object to my just throwing out these ideas. I do so because I believe in this little bit of progress, and as we read about military tribunals, courts of international justice, it's worth thinking about. This is all retrospective analysis, demonstrates a hint of humanitarian wisdom made possible by temporal and spatial distance. It's based on my contacts and the research of others, such as Bradley Smith in the book called Reaching Judgment at Nuremberg. It's not my field. But in the final section I will present to you, I am, to pardon the boast, somewhat of an expert. I'm going to talk about myself, a memoir of who I was 50 years ago, and in order to keep it shorter, to prevent my wandering off nostalgically into digressions, I will read this. The title is Remember Nuremberg, the View from the Berenschanstrasse. Now, the Berenschanstrasse is a little side street on which part of the Palace of Justice is found, and it so happens we were billeted right across the street. Now, I may not seem to get to the point immediately, but I will. So, bear with me. When sent to Nuremberg, I was fully aware that I was involved in a significant historical event. At the time, I viewed it as a postscript to the war, an act of magnanimity which would demonstrate once and for all the horror of the Nazi atrocities and their futility. At the same time, I harbored the less magnanimous conviction that the leaders of the Third Reich were guilty, that they would hang, that they should hang. I was 18. Since then, I've come to realize that there was indeed a great deal of magnanimity on the part of many who set up and conducted the trial. I've also come to realize that whereas Old Testament axioms apply, an eye for an eye, those who live by the sword, etc., the long-range significance of the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg has to do with the conduct of nations in conflict and with the humanizing of behavior during international and intranational settlings of account. I was in Nuremberg from January 1946 until mid-48. My remembrances, while they do not have a place in the annals of international law, do add a few threads to the tapestry of events at Nuremberg. My addition to the story are what Flaubert called the little significant details. Mine was the view from the Baronstrasse. Being 18, a private in the U.S. Army in 1945 meant that I was anxious to serve my country. I knew that our side was good and the Axis powers bad. Democracy was right. The war was over and there would be no others. The above is not an abbreviated summary. It constitutes my thinking on these subjects in its entirety. I felt sheepish in context of GIs who had seen action who were now being repatriated. They were recognized heroes while we had sailed eastward from a New York harbor displaying messages such as, "Welcome home, job well done." The veterans in Nuremberg felt the War Department was dragging out their Army service, and while they waited, they griped and got drunk. Seemed normal to me. 18-year-olds tend to be sort of males, tend to be sort of dumb. Females are catching up. I was a graduate of the Manhattan High School of Aviation Trades, trained to earn a living servicing airplanes, and nothing in my profile suggested that I go to college, let alone hang out there for the rest of my life. Those of you who experienced the GI Bill of Rights recognize that these radical changes of direction and vocation are not that unusual. So, in order to manage the remembering, the piecing together of the experience, I had to conjure up a pre-professional past, my pre-college identity. Not at all an easy task, if you're going to be honest. And it turns out, not a pleasant one. It involved many letters I had sent home, letters which now seem to have been written by someone I never knew, someone I do not particularly care for. I was judgmental, superficial, boring. Once settled into the routine of my job, I seemed almost oblivious to the drama and historical weight of the proceedings in which I had a part. I wrote of workload, my colleagues, my superiors, my billets, my leisure activities. There were occasional observations and encounters with Germans, consistently referred to as Krauts. I derived no small satisfaction from their beaten state, their inability to obtain sufficient food and other essentials, their begging for handouts, their pouncing on cigarette butts flicked away by the victors. None had ever been a Nazi. This information was always volunteer. This was an international military tribunal, not only inside the fortress. Nuremberg was in the American zone of occupation, and the prison administration and security were handled by the U.S. Army. However, the ceremonial guard duty of the Palace of Justice was assumed in turn on a monthly basis by companies of soldiers of the four occupying powers. I remember no contacts with the French or British, but I did chat with some Russians. Very strange fellows. They'd been paid all at once at the end of the war and pranced around with satchels of money. Favorite purchases were watches with luminous dials. And I saw some with whole collections of ascending the length of their arms. That did not strike me as strange as the pride they took in the length of their military service. By 1946, the war over, the GI derived a certain prestige from the brevity of service. One Russian acquaintance pounded his chest, making his medals bounce to boast of his 5 years plus. I remember the old city of Nuremberg, the medieval walled city, the fortress, the Church of Our Lady, the old houses and monuments, the sort of place I now explore at length. At the time, not much left. Empty streets lined with rubble, 5, 6 feet high, in which we practiced stunt driving jeeps. At work, I remember Lieutenant Jack Wills, my immediate superior. That kind of Texan braggart often talked about catching that winning pass in the end zone at some university, and who gained some notoriety later because he was the one who made it possible for Goring to get the poison with which he committed suicide just before the executions were to take place. In charge of the Palace of Justice and the prison was a Colonel Andrews. I don't know how effective he was. All I remember was seeing him showing dignitaries around, senators, congressmen, Eleanor Roosevelt, dressed in his uniform and his chrome-plated helmet, which was shined daily by Sergeant McGee, whose additional duty was training the colonel's drinking class. We also taught democracy to German youth. One colonel put it, we're going to teach them democracy if we have to hit them over the head. And we did this by showing them how to play baseball. They loved baseball. The candy bar we gave them had nothing to do with it. Now this sounds like fun, this unenlightened, all too typical daily routine. But there's another side to my participation. I brought to Nuremberg some baggage which is not your standard general issue. When you're Jewish and you get yourself born in Germany in 1927, it's likely that you'll develop some characteristics which set you apart, if indeed you're spared to develop. Because you see, very gradually, you come to understand that which is made clear to you every day, but which you are reluctant to accept, namely that 10% of your countrymen, neighbors, colleagues, schoolmates, teachers think you should be destroyed. 80% don't really agree, but what can they do? And besides, they don't know. And another 10% oppose persecution and either get out or join the victims. My figures are based on impressionistic data. Thanks to parental foresight and luck, my mother, brother, and I moved to Luxembourg in 1935 and in 1938 to the United States. We'd lost most of our material possessions, but by 1945, that mattered little. We were comfortable, and in spite of the burden of being different, mine had been a happy New York adolescence. Some of our relations preceded us. A few followed. Most perished. My maternal grandmother, the person I loved most. My paternal grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Their annihilation in Theresienstadt and elsewhere was documented by the bureaucratically efficient machinery of planned destruction which makes the Holocaust unique. I knew they were gone, but I continued looking for them in transports and camps for displaced persons. At home, we had not talked about it. It was always there, in generalized references during congregational assemblies, religious rituals for the dead. But our private grief was shared stoically in silence. The grief was part of my emotional paraphernalia when I arrived at the Palace of Justice. So was hatred and the desire for vengeance. The hatred was abstract, directed at a generic group called Germans. Like the Soviets, representing their nation in the courtroom, and for the same reasons, like Churchill, I wanted them hanged, bombed, destroyed. They taught me well. Individually, no German ever aroused feelings that extreme. I would feel disdain, repugnance, superiority. But I had no desire to hurt anyone. The Nuremberg defendants, as a group, were part of the abstraction. First time I saw Goring was when we crossed paths in a wooden enclosed passageway which led from the prison to the courthouse. I was delivering the day's mail to the prison. He was being escorted to the courthouse. The passage was about 4 feet wide. I stopped, stepped aside, intimidated. This bothered me for a long time, and I guess it still does. In my letters home, I spoke of such encounters, of letters I was reading, but in part to spare my mother, I assumed my guarded, stoic mode. I did not display my feelings. I sent home the excerpts and shared it with you. Commentary I felt was superfluous, and frankly, I still can't comprehend the doublethink of these individuals. Their obvious moral awareness, the authenticity of their family bonds, and then somehow the total suspension of these feelings and convictions in their dealings with groups who, in the final analysis, were deemed inconvenient. For Albert Camus, the criminal is one who has an ignorant heart, who accepts the plague which kills. I do not believe from what I read in these letters that their hearts were ignorant. On the other count, fermenting, accepting the plague, spreading it, I return a verdict of guilty. And that is my judgment, or at least the present state of my evolving opinion. I'm a reluctant judge. I judge in spite of myself. It is a judgment derived after long deliberations, a judgment informed by the thinking of wise mentors like Albert Camus. I've not forgiven anyone. Forgiving is a godlike act, and I'm not that presumptuous. Besides, no one has asked me for forgiveness. I've not forgotten either. The memory of what happened protects me from complacency. Nor is Nuremberg just a fading abstraction. Avatars like Rwanda, Burundi, Zaire have not been far from my mind since I have a daughter who served there in that area. Fortunately, I do not dwell on the past. I have the distractions of much that is good in life to safeguard me from the temptation of victimhood. I live well and in contentment, and that also is a form of revenge. And on that paradox, leading to yet other dilemmas, I conclude. Thank you. I'll answer some questions, but if you have time, I've got a few samples of this, of the 201 file, little pictures you might come up and look at.
Did you actually witness the trials? I mean, with a censor? You weren't involved?
No, I worked in an office, but I had a pass to go to the courtroom whenever I wished. I did not go very often because most of the time it was rather dull. I was just shuffling in papers, handing papers back and forth. Certain occasions when the defendants were making their last statements and the verdicts came out, that of course was more exciting.
Did everybody have to translate from German into all the other languages?
Well, the trials were also significant, and this was the first time they had simultaneous translation. it worked quite well. Everyone had a microphone, including the defendants. And it gave a certain advantage to people like Goring and Schacht, who spoke English, so that they could understand what the prosecution was saying, but in waiting for the translation, they could prepare their answers. That's, I think, the first time that was tried. Yes, sir.
Do you have any personal recollections of Justice Robert Jackson, who seems to have become kind of a modern folk hero for this episode?
Well, no personal recollection, but I have just gotten a little bit of familiarity with the Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. And the person in charge of that happens to be here, Mr. Greg Peterson. So I hope to be going up there to see just what kinds of collections they have and learn more about them. But I had no contact with them. Yes, sir.
I had the honor of meeting Justice Jackson at Christmas in 1924 at the party given by Donald Richford, who partnership case in Roosevelt. And I got the impression from Jackson that he was an extremely wonderful man and gentle and kind. And I'm sure the probably performed the same way in the courtroom. And then secondly, I wanted to ask you, did you have any matters with respect to Gary and his suicide, and you question about that, and how that seemed to work
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that well. Are you asking how Goring committed suicide?
No, I wondered if you knew the fact that your occupation there as the censor got involved in any way in his inquiries into his suicide, any assistance given by yourself with respect to that suicide and so forth.
No, what happened was, I might say I left about 10 days before the question.
Repeat the question, please.
I think the question was to ask whether I had some input or some knowledge, or some role in providing the means for Goring's suicide. Is that the question?
I don't mean to infer that you might have had any role.
Speak up.
Stand
Stand up and speak up. We can't hear you.
Well, my question was, in view of the fact that Gary committed suicide, and in view of the fact that you were a censor, were you in any way involved in that investigation?
Did you hear it now?
Yeah.
This room is terrible for communicating from back to front. It's notorious for that. And I think we're going to tear it down. What would you like to build here? No, I knew nothing about it except retrospectively. I didn't even know how he had managed to do it. There were rumors that he'd hidden it in a tooth. There were rumors he'd hidden it in a navel, and there was plenty of room there. So, the truth was, he had a capsule, and this was revealed by the physician at Nuremberg. He had a capsule hidden in some skin, a lotion, kept with his property. And he had made arrangements with Lieutenant Wheelis to provide that for him at the last night. And the physician, I've forgotten his name, has the remains of the capsule where it was hidden. But no, I was not involved in the investigation. I had left by then.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Have you seen the second movie on Nuremberg with Alec Baldwin? And if so, do you have any reaction?
No, I have not seen that. I saw Judgment at Nuremberg with Maximilian Schell, which I thought was wonderful in retrospect now, primarily because it captured the atmosphere, the beginning awareness of the problems of Soviet. As I point out, my 18-year-old ignorance, I remember pictures in the newspapers of Johnny shaking hands with Ivan as they were meeting. They were our friends. So No, I haven't seen that. Yes, ma'am.
My dad was one of the psychiatrists at Nuremberg. He was in the Army at the time. His name was Dr. Paul Schrader. He was one of the 10 psychiatrists from the 4 countries. And he, although he was born in the U.S., spoke German until he was 9 years old because they lived in a little parochial town. And I presume since you lived in Germany from 1927 to 35, that you spoke German.
Yes.
It was extremely helpful, wasn't it?
Well, that's why they put me in that position. Because when I first went to the replacement depot, they said, well, what do you want to do? Signal for a medic before it's all open. Oh, you speak German. You're going to Nuremberg. And then I started shaking. I had visions of it. My degree from, my diploma from the Manhattan High School of Aviation Trades being in the courtroom translating. But I did manage to read. I could read the letters and spoke enough to deal with some translations, since we were in charge of the possessions that were being kept in a separate room. Sometimes I had to go to the prison with an officer for some translation. But there were a number of psychiatrists, psychologists. I worked next door to Gustav Gilbert, who wrote a book called 21 Cells in Nuremberg. And there were others. Yes?
Did you find very many instances of material in the letters that you suspected maybe might be important? And if so, what did you find, get advice from? What did you do further?
No, we read the mail, we stamped it to let them know that they were being censored, mail going both ways, so that they were very careful not to include secrets. And I don't remember any situation where we had to report something. Packages, obviously, we had to look at, but otherwise, no. So our main function was to intercept mail like this, which would have disturbed their psychological well-being. Yes.
Could you recommend some reading on this factual, objective reading?
Well, on my topic, the book I mentioned, Bradley F. Smith, what did I say? Coming to Judgment at Nuremberg, is it?
Reaching.
I didn't bring it with me.
It's Reaching Judgment at Nuremberg.
Reaching Judgment at Nuremberg, thank you. Otherwise, no, I'll confess to you that I do not like giving this talk. Every time I do it, and I've done it now 3 or 4 times, it involves going over notes, reading something additional. Last time I read the Goldhagen book, and I begin to realize that I think I know how bad it was, but it was even worse. To prepare for this, I read an issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association dealing with the physicians, Nazi physicians, and some of the atrocities they committed. So that every time I think I know how bad it is, it's even worse. And then there's the realization that it's not over. It's still happening. I've talked about trials in Rwanda and Bosnia. But for political reasons, there are no trials in Somalia, there are no trials in the Sudan, there are no trials in Cambodia. So it's very painful for me. And I'm not a scholar in this, I'm not even a historian, but I do read once in a while, especially when something comes out dealing with new processes, new attempts at doing something about it. But there's much information available. I imagine now there's quite a bit happening dealing with the problem of international courts.
How many censors were there, and did you read, did several different censors read the same letter?
No, there were 4 of us, dealt with all of it. One of them, 3 of us were my age, 18, 19. One was a little older, and he was able to read the German script, which we had difficulty with. A lot of the, not a lot, but quite a bit of the mail coming in especially is written in the old German script, which I can make out if I work at it long enough, but it's not easy.